espionage, hacking, terrorism, economic warfare, political spin, clandestine operations. Unredacted with Rachel Marsden, lifting the black ink to reveal the covert information and intelligence around global events. And now, here is your host, Rachel Marsden.
Hey, how's everybody doing today? It's Rachel Marsden. Thanks for joining us here on Unredacted. We have another great show for you today. First up, our guest is coming on in about 13 minutes. Ido Aharoni, the former Consul General of Israel to New York, to talk about everything related to diplomacy, in particular with respect to the conflict in Ukraine. As you know, Vladimir Zelensky, Ukrainian president, made a very emotional appeal to many world governing bodies and state governing bodies, various countries' parliaments and national assemblies, including Israel. So we're going to see how that went over. And we're also going to find out from Ido, who is a career diplomat for Israel. And as you know, Israel is constantly dealing with many different diplomatic issues all around the world. So we're going to find out what his perspective is on any potential resolution of this conflict and how he thinks that needs to be approached. There's a lot of talk about the fact that we're headed for a long, drawn-out process, that a lot of one-upmanship that's still going on. So is there a chance for peace? And if so, where does that chance lie and by what avenue? So we're going to talk to him about that. So how are you guys doing? By the way, you can listen to us through any of the platforms that you can find streaming on: Twitch, YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey. We're on all of them. So please feel free to join us whatever way you want to or can. We're also live on Twitter and on Facebook Live and on LinkedIn. So whichever way you're joining us today, thank you so much for tuning in. We have a great show for you today. First up, as always, I have a few things to say to start the show. I don't know what kind of week you guys are having, but it's certainly better than one person's. And I think that one person is Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who happens to be here in the EU SSR, the European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which I now call this place where I am currently based here in Paris, France, and the entire region around it, because we are faced with everything from censorship to restrictions to economic sanctions that are actually geared to Russia, but fly back in our faces and hit us in ways that we're currently finding out are not too convenient. So Justin is at the mothership, Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau. And I speak as a Canadian when I say that it's not exactly the best outing for Canada at the EU. So I'm going to explain to you exactly why. And I have some clips. I came really armed with the receipts for this one. So Justin Trudeau is on a tour of Europe, pretty much complaining about Canadians. I don't know how you guys feel about that, if you are Canadian or if you can project yourself as being somebody from a country about whom your leader is constantly complaining about the people he has to govern and who may or may not have elected him. But this was Justin Trudeau yesterday at the European Union Parliament in Brussels, speaking about the Freedom Convoy trucker protesters, whom of you are probably aware are were protesting government COVID era and vaccine mandates in Ottawa for a few weeks until Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act, which is essentially martial law, to clear them out and block bank accounts of people who had even supported the movement, and rallied supporters to start arguing that it was a foreign-funded movement, none of which has been proven. And in fact, even the CBC, the state broadcaster, came out and said there's no evidence that it was ever a foreign-funded movement. It's just people who opposed the government policy. So here's Trudeau in the European Union talking about his people.
Unfortunately, we're seeing a rise in cynical populists who are trying to exploit these anxieties. They pretend to have easy solutions that play on people's fears. Even in Canada, where 90% of people are vaccinated, and our motto as a country is peace, order, and good government, we saw anti-vaccine and anti-government protests devolve into illegal occupations of our communities and blockades of our borders. The leaders of those convoys were effective in turning citizens with real anxieties against the system best suited to allay those concerns.
Oh yeah, right. Because as as everybody knows, in Canada and everywhere else, the government did nothing but help people during the COVID pandemic, right? Did not tell us that we couldn't work, did not tell us that we didn't have our basic fundamental rights of association, of travel, of labor, which are all enshrined, recognized human rights. No, the government had nothing to do with the fact that we were anxious about our livelihood, about life in general, playing up fear constantly. No, that they were just there to save us, right? Yeah. And meanwhile, Trudeau talks about the fact that 90% of the truckers were vaccinated. He really, either he's totally obtuse or he just doesn't get it. It wasn't about anti-vaxxers. It was about pro-choice, which I thought Trudeau supported. He keeps saying he supports pro-choice, but I guess not when it comes to his populists. Now, as I keep saying, we're no longer in this paradigm of right-left ideology. The Cold War is over. Yes, I know that there's a situation where the West is against Russia right now, but it's not communism versus capitalism. The paradigm now is populists versus globalists. Russia backs freedom of choice for people, populism. In fact, they're accused of backing it and supporting it, even financially, in Europe. So there are some responses that came up to Trudeau from the German far-right populist party in the European Parliament, and they absolutely lambasted him. So I'm going to get you to hold that thought for a minute. I'm teasing you for a little bit later because I see that our guest is on the line right now. I want to get straight to him. But afterwards, I'm going to play some of the responses to Trudeau's statements by some of these so-called populist party members in the European Parliament. And Trudeau was sitting right in front of them. So you're going to want to hang tight for this right after the interview with our guest. And with no further ado, I see that he's on the line, so I'm going to take him right away. Ido Aharoni, are you there?
Yes, I am. I hope you can hear me.
I can. We can hear you perfectly. Ido, I was just telling people that you are a career diplomat. You spent your entire career in public service. You were Consul General of Israel in New York. And you have just this insane encyclopedic knowledge and real kind of gut instinct when it comes to diplomacy and how to resolve conflicts. And I think today that's really what's needed, particularly with respect to this really serious issue in Ukraine. And it seems like everybody's worried about where this is going and concerned about whether or not this is even, if it can be resolved. So I'm really, and I think the audience as well, is really looking forward to hearing your advice and you with respect to this conflict. So Welcome to the
Oh,
show.
thank you so
We're
much.
really honored to have you.
Thank
So,
you so much. It's a pleasure. Yes.
so Ido, what is your initial reaction to what we're seeing today with respect to Ukraine? And do you think there's an off-ramp to this?
So you mentioned the context of diplomacy. It's important to mention to our listeners that diplomacy, from its very inception, was viewed with a great deal of suspicion, to the point that from day one, people were demanding new type of diplomacy, or diplomacy without diplomats. And diplomacy had a very bad reputation because initially it was associated with privilege, with secrecy. It was associated with entitlement, and mostly it was blamed for the failure to prevent wars. So when you look at the history of World War One, World War Two, when you look at many other instances in recent history, diplomats were the first to be blamed for their inability or for being unsuccessful preventing war. And sometimes one has to admit honestly and candidly that diplomacy is not equipped to handle a certain situation. I'm not sure that we are in that particular point right now when you're looking at the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because the conflict between Russia and Ukraine tells a much bigger story than the story of Russia and Ukraine. It's a story of that involves national ethos. It's a story that involves the formation and the shaping of the global arena post Soviet Union, post the end of the Cold War. Where's China playing in here is a big question. So it's a conflict seemingly on territory between two actors, but I think it's a story that goes way beyond that story. It's a story about how technology is interfering with our national ethos. It's a story about the other forces that are going to emerge alongside the United States in the future. In the first place, the European Union, China, possibly India, which is also a big player. And where's Russia fitting in all this?
Yeah, I mean, part of me was also asking the question, and you hinted at it there, of whether or not this is just a foregone conclusion. If we're headed for a global fracture that was a foregone conclusion, and this is just kind of a symptom of that fracture, and we're heading back towards kind of like an east-west dichotomy, and I guess a split that would ultimately result in a fracture in what we have come to know as this global market or globalization. Do you think that globalization is eroding as a result of this, that there's a chance that we're backing away from that?
No, I don't. I think that, especially because of COVID-19, we actually accelerated the pace of connectivity, and we reached a point of hyperconnectivity. And in many ways, globalization, if you think of globalization as the free transfer of goods and services and human beings and ideas, think about globalization in the context of hyperconnectivity. Here we are, I'm sitting in the lobby of the Museum of the Jewish People in the heart of Tel Aviv, and you're sitting in Paris. And here we are talking about Ukraine and Russia. That's globalization. Ideas know no boundaries. And I think that will only accelerate. It's true that, unlike the expectation of some European intellectuals, the decentralization of information, the democratization of information, did not bring down authoritarian regimes. On the contrary, it made open, pluralistic societies more vulnerable to information manipulation, and it allowed authoritarian regimes to have a tighter grip on the sources of information. And so, paradoxically, the democratization of information actually weakened pluralistic societies and strengthened authoritarian regimes. And I'm sure that all the theorists that wrote about it many, many years ago are pretty surprised to see what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, Ido, I have a hard time telling the difference between democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes these days when YouTube is blocking my show. And I'm sitting in Europe and I'm an independent journalist and I am constantly having to create new things not because they're blocking me personally, but because there's this effort to associate some of us with certain platforms to which we license our programming and to block our voices on that pretext. And when we see Justin Trudeau in Canada, and being Canadian, I'm speaking from not personal experience because I'm not based there, but I'm speaking about my own country. And it's frightening when there are protests that are just people against the government status quo when it comes to, or the conventional wisdom when it comes to vaccine mandates, people losing their jobs as a result of not being vaccinated, and people starting to push back as a result of that, and just average citizens. And then you end up with these narratives coming out of government, seeping out through corporate media, that these people are foreign backed, that they're useful idiots of some greater power. And that has since been denied even by the state broadcaster. They said there was no foreign funding, even though Mark Carney and the former governor of the Bank of Canada in England said that was the case. And then you have Trudeau invoking the Emergencies Act and blocking bank accounts of people who donated to the truckers who were buying them fuel and supporting them. I'm worried about where we're going in terms of democracy
Yeah.
or so-called democracies. I mean, what's going on there, do you think?
Yeah. So I'm interested in the impact of information overload. There's a very famous Israeli historian and philosopher whose name is Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote the book *Sapiens*, in which he's making a very powerful and valid and effective argument, saying that technological innovation has far exceeded human evolution to the point the human brain is unable to effectively handle so many stimulations simultaneously. What happens when our brain is being bombarded with so many signals and so many pieces of information? We are overwhelmed naturally. As a result, the level of anxiety goes up. When the level of anxiety goes up, our judgment is impaired as human beings. But more importantly, and this is, I think, right to your point, we are craving simplicity in the face of growing complexity. And that's really what you're seeing all over the world to the diplomatic and the political discourse. For example, the inability to understand nuance. Look how quickly the world shaped an opinion on Russia versus Ukraine. How long did it take for so many global corporations to make a decision? Things that would have taken years, if not decades before, took place within 3 days. Again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just pointing to the fact that information overload is the main reason why the current political discourse, especially in countries where there is an attempt to cultivate and nurture an open and transparent discussion, why this discussion is lacking nuance, is lacking depth. It's one-dimensional in many places. It's black versus white, and there is no room for gray. And if you ask me, this is going to be one of the biggest questions of our time. How do we effectively deal with the hazards of information overload?
Right. I mean, you mentioned that, and the first thing that came to mind, I've mentioned it on this show before, so it'll be familiar to the listeners or the viewers. This idea of, everybody on social media immediately just went from having their 3 doses in their, their emoticons of 3 doses in their social media profiles to just like getting rid of that and adding the Ukraine flag, or just like adding the Ukraine flag to the 3 doses in the emojis that they had in their profile. And it's like, and it happened almost immediately. Like, as you said, people took an immediate position on this instead of, and it seems like there's a peer pressure. And as you say, it crosses all boundaries. It's global, a peer pressure to adhere to a certain conventional narrative. And there's also a lot of pressure on these technological platforms to limit, or through algorithms or otherwise censor voices that happen to go against conventional narratives. I don't know what to do about that, frankly. Is there anything we can do about that? What do you think the solution is?
Well, I'm a technologist. What does it mean? Technologist, people like me would have been condemned in the 1980s as technological determinists. You're a Canadian, so I'm sure you're familiar with the name Marshall McLuhan. When I studied
was the message.
here, when I studied right here in this university in the 1980s, I'm right now on the campus of Tel Aviv University. Marshall McLuhan was, I wouldn't say was condemned, but he was not taken seriously because they claimed he put too much emphasis on technology. I happen to be a technologist, meaning I really think technology is critically important. I believe that the same technology that created the problem that we're facing of lack of verification, of the ability to so easily interrupt and disrupt massive systems, of misinforming and disinforming entire segments, the very same technology will be able to come up with a solution. I believe the solution will be blockchain based. I believe the solution will start with verification of sources of information. The technology of verification methodologies already exists in software, for example. Those technologies exist. We just need to adapt them to the whole business of information creation and news. And that will help. It will not change, dramatically. Fake news is as old as human civilization itself. So there's nothing new about fake news. People always try to misinform and disinform and manipulate others. There's nothing new about that. But what technology will allow us to do is to at least verify the source. If something was cooked by other people, we at least will have the technology that will alert us. Another thing that we need to remember is that it has to be proactive. People have to be responsible and accountable. So we should teach ourselves, at least I'm trying to teach my own students, to practice what I call informational distancing. What does it mean? It means that, and I'm sure you have your own news outlets that you favor, and I have my own news outlets. Try to limit yourself to a certain number of outlets that you rely on, that you believe in, that you trust, and try not to be member of too many WhatsApp groups, and try not to receive too much information from sources that you don't trust and you don't believe. And that way, it's true, you may even tighten your own echo chamber, but on the other hand, you will limit your exposure to unnecessary sources of irrelevant information, because the biggest problem in information overload is that a big chunk of the information is irrelevant. For example, I remember when the COVID-19 crisis broke out, I had to force myself not to consume all the information that there was out there about COVID-19, because I knew if I will do that, it will consume all my time, and it will not improve my situation in any way, shape, or form.
But what do we do about these so-called fact checkers? Because I don't know what the situation is in Israel, but there are newspapers here in France that literally have fact-checking divisions who publish nothing but corrections of what they consider to be fake news. And often it's not a correction of fake news. It's just a reorientation of a narrative. And I read them because sometimes I go, okay, well, this is interesting. I wonder what was wrong about it. And I start reading it and I realize that they're not actually addressing incorrect facts. They're addressing an issue that was presented in a way that either they or their management don't agree with, and they're reorienting the reader towards a different narrative under the guise of fact checking. And
Right.
I see that more often than not. So
Yeah.
This
So
kind of goes
that
to the
started
question:
with, yeah, I think it started
who
with the
determines
rise
what
of
fake
the.
news is?
So I totally agree with you on that. It started really with the rise of the network society in the 1990s when the internet became more and more prevalent, and media organizations felt, traditional media organizations felt that they're fighting for their lives, and as a result, they became more attuned editorially to what they perceived to be their base. That's how Fox News became Fox News, and that's how the New York Times became the New York Times. The New York Times used to be more of an international newspaper. In those years, I lived in Los Angeles.
Whoop. I think we lost Ido. We're going to see if we can. I'm going to see if we can. Yeah, there's a poor connection at Ido's end. I don't know if Ido. I don't know if you can hear me, but we have a poor connection here. So, and I can see that it's a connection issue at Ido's end. So, I'm gonna hope that he can reconnect with us and see if we can bring him back. Sorry guys, I'm able to see on my screen here that there we go. That's better. We got him back. Hey Ido, sorry, there was a connection failure.
Oh, well, I'm
But
sure it was on my part.
we have you back.
So, yeah, so basically
No,
what
that's
I said
okay.
was that the phenomenon that you're describing is a direct result of the rise of the internet and the fact that traditional media outlets felt the need to cater more to their base or their perceived base. And as a result, we created, conversations. I call them niche conversations. The niche can be giant, can be gigantic. The New York Times has 20 million people reading the paper online. Fox News is a gigantic niche, but at the end of the day, it's a niche because ultimately we're all preaching to our own choirs, and that's the danger. That's the danger of the situation we're in.
Yeah, and it's really getting bad. I find that there's more and more of a polarization of just the average public to the likes of which I don't think I've ever seen before. I mean, am I wrong about that, Ido? Was there a time in history that you can remember where public opinion was just so polarized?
Oh yeah, definitely. The thing is that in those days, think about the rise of Nazism in Europe and Germany. In those days, the technology was different. I can tell you, for example, my parents lived in Israel during the Holocaust, and I was very curious about what they knew. And I asked them, what did you know real time about what was happening? And it turned out that there was mostly rumors. The rumors were so outrageous that people did not believe them. There were rumors. My father told me, who would have believed that they're building factories to exterminate Jews? He said it sounded too imaginary to be true. So it's not that they dismissed it, they just stored it in the back of their minds. It didn't seem like something real. So rumors is a very effective channel of communications. Gossip is a very, very effective channel of communication. So in those days, was mostly, or during the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain, there were lots of jokes. So humor was a very effective channel of communications to communicate what was happening in the Soviet Union. There were books written about the jokes and so on. So, yeah, polarization is not something new. What's new is the speed, the access, the abundance of information that is accessible to us, and how quickly and how accurately we can retrieve this information. That's new. And think about the people like Julian Assange. If Julian Assange wanted to do what he did in the 1940s or the 1930s, he technologically, practically, he could not have done it. It was impossible for him to do it because there was no such platform that will allow him to share so much classified information. So yeah, the differences of opinions always existed. What didn't exist is the megaphone, the amplification.
Do you think that as a result of that amplification and the fact that people have access to so many other different platforms, that there is a panic on the part of nation states who are intent, more so perhaps than previously, on controlling a narrative that over which they're increasingly losing control?
So, I used to work for the Israeli government for many, many years, and I can tell you that I worked with, and I also tell this to my students, and I met many diplomats from the US, from Canada, from France, from other places. And for the most part, at least when it comes to diplomats, I met hardworking people, well-meaning people, with no hidden agenda. If you could accuse them of something, it would be maybe incompetence rather than malice. And those people really try to do good by their client, quote unquote, and accurately and reliably tell the story of their nation. The thing is that we're less interested in nation states. We're more interested in cities today. The rising economic, political, and cultural unit of our time is the city and not the nation. When you look at competition pre-COVID-19 in Europe, competition is mostly between cities. Barcelona, for example, reached a point of over-tourism. They had too many tourists. They were trying to limit the number of tourists. You look at Germany. There's Germany and there's Berlin. You look at France. There's France and there's Paris. You look at the UK. There's the UK and there's London. And Israel, you have Tel Aviv and you have the rest of Israel. So cities are becoming gradually more and more important. I always give the example of Seattle. Nations don't know what to do with Seattle. But let me tell you, Seattle is one of the most important places in the world. It's the home of Microsoft. It's the home of Amazon. It's the home of Boeing. It's the home of Expedia. It's the home of Starbucks. If you like fashion, it's the home of Nordstrom. And I can go on and on and on. And show me one nation that knows what to do on a strategic level with Seattle. One nation that is giving Seattle the attention Seattle deserves. There aren't too many nations that understand the importance of Seattle, because Seattle is the home of some of the most influential multinational corporations.
So what should they be doing instead to
Oh,
cater
they should look at Seattle the same way they look at any other country. They should open an office there. They should work with Amazon as if Amazon was the United Nations. And they should spend time working with Amazon, cultivating ties with all layers of management at Amazon, working with Amazon. Amazon is one of the most important players in the world today. Let me ask you something. If you had to give the task of eradicating world hunger to an organization, would you give it to the United Nations or would you give it to Amazon?
It's funny you say that, because as soon as you started mentioning the United Nations and world hunger, I thought of Elon Musk and his offer to solve world hunger for $6 billion of his own money if the UN was able to do it. I don't know if, I think they did take him up on that offer. I don't know where it sits right now, but he seems to have a concrete plan to solve world hunger. Would you trust Elon Musk over the UN?
Absolutely, in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
In a heartbeat. And it has nothing to do with him. It's just that I know the United Nations. It's an organization that very quickly achieved a stage of stagnation. When the UN was founded initially by 51 states, it was a forward-looking, progressive organization that wanted to promote peace and wanted to promote collaboration. And today it's an organization with 193 members that is anti-Western, automatically anti-Israel, by the way. They could and would pass any resolution against Israel. It's unbelievable that their Human Rights Commission was led at one time by Syria and Libya, two of the worst violators of human rights in the world, two of the worst offenders of human rights in the world. And I can give you many examples of how the United Nations has become a shrine of duplicity and hypocrisy. And so there's no doubt in my mind that while the UN was established with good intentions, the UN of today is unable to produce anything, that is remotely resembling its original charter. Unfortunately, I say this unfortunately because the world needs the United Nations. I also believe that the way the world will recover from the crisis of COVID-19 will be very similar to the way the world recovered from the trauma of World War II, which would mean increased interdependence, increased collaboration. One of the examples is the vaccine. Look at how quickly the vaccine was approved. Again, some people think it's a bad thing, but there's no doubt that it required cross-border collaboration. And I believe this is going to be the way of the future.
So getting back to all these conflicts, I mean, it seems like we just careen these days, and I'm talking on a global level, from one crisis to another. I mean, we went from COVID to Ukraine to, I don't know, maybe World War III. How do you think technology plays on that? Do you think it has a role?
Yeah, of course. So technology is, again, the pace of technological advancement is so high that we can't even begin to understand. And this is before quantum computing has any practical, applications. And imagine what would happen in the future when it comes to AI. So we don't know much about the future, but this we do know. It has a lot to do with technology. We do know that life expectancy is on the rise. When my father was born in 1926, life expectancy for men in this part of the world was around 49. My father died in 91. His grandkids and his great-grandkids are projected to have life expectancy of 90 years. This all happened during the 20th century that a lot of people call the bloodiest century in history. Yet during the very same century, science made so much progress, eradicated most lethal diseases, and basically increased life expectancy in decades. So that's one thing we know about the future, that life expectancy is going to be 95, even in our lifetime. Second thing that we know about the future is that world population is going to grow by 2050 to 10 billion. Today we're 7.5 billion. 10 billion people on this planet would require a plan. Third thing that we know, that despite of COVID-19, the world is going, 75% of those 10 billion people by 2050 will live in big cities. Again, making the point I made before, that cities are going to be the most important unit. And it makes sense. If you think about cities have been around for 10,000 years, nation states have been around only for 800 years. It makes sense that cities will resume their centrality in the future. So given all those things that I just mentioned, the rise in life expectancy, which is all about technology and life science, the move to big cities with automation, with artificial intelligence, with quantum computing, it's all about technology. And the rise in the population, we will have to find a way to support these people. Now, assuming that AI would kick in, you're going to have 10 billion people here by 2050. Most of the jobs, as we know them today, including our job, will probably disappear, or at least there will be a viable alternative. So what people are going to do? It's a big question, big philosophical question. I believe that the answer is that the purpose of life is not going to be to have a job or to have a career. The purpose of life will be to create or to co-create. It will be Renaissance induced. I'll call it Renaissance on triple espresso. It will be an era of unprecedented growth of knowledge, unprecedented production of knowledge, unprecedented creativity. That's my view. Because what are you going to do with all the creativity of 10 billion people?
I don't know where, I know you're in Tel Aviv, Ido, but here in Paris, when I look around me, all I see are people glued to screens, and they aren't creating a whole heck of a lot. So you have a much more optimistic view of mankind than I do vis-a-vis this technological world we live in, where people are just consuming. I don't see very much production. I mean,
Right.
maybe things are different in Tel Aviv.
Well, Tel Aviv definitely is one of the hubs of creativity today in the world. In Israel, we have about 8,000 startup companies, but Israeli creativity is manifested not only in technology. You can find Israeli creativity in the kitchen. Israeli cuisine is celebrated all over the world. Israeli wine, Israeli art, Israeli filmmaking. If you're watching any of the streaming services today, there are lots of Israeli content available, which was not the case 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, Israel is a perfect example of how creativity can actually push a society forward. And I believe that's the solution. Again, obviously, there are going to be instances and examples, maybe, hope not, but maybe, France was always on the cutting edge of creativity. I always remember the major contribution of the French culture to literature and filmmaking. And of course, music. Today I was mentioning Jacques Brel in the lecture I gave here to young Israelis, talking about how in Israel until 1967, the dream of every young Israeli was to go to Paris. That ended with the French embargo of 1967. Then the dream became New York. And I was born in 1962, so I was born right when my dream became New York. And it's funny that you mentioned you're Canadian. I was telling this to the kids today. When I was growing up in Israel in the 1960s, I was fascinated with the whole notion of America. And I was introduced to what I thought was American music, right? I was introduced to Leonard Cohen, Neil Young.
Canadian.
I watched movies based on Mordechai Richler's books, like The Apprenticeship of Derek Kravitz and so on. And I was convinced I'm watching American movies and I'm consuming American music. I had no idea that this was all Canadian. So I gave this as an example to show them how the power of what we call popular culture. And so yeah, I hope that France will embrace that moment of nurturing creativity. But I am a great believer, not so much in I do see the dangers you're talking about. I do see the dangers, but I'm a great believer in the creative spirit of people. People are inspired by others' creativity, and I'm a great believer in that.
Yeah, and actually, when you mentioned that aspect of what's going on with young people in Israel right now, I know some young people from Israel or in Israel who do have that creative spirit and that motivation to create something, particularly using technology. How did that happen? Like, why are Israeli youth really kind of motivated by that, whereas here it's kind of like they're passive consumers? Did the Israeli government do something, or was there some kind of initiative behind that?
So
What
yeah,
happened?
so it's a combination of several things. First of all,
We have a problem again with the connection. It looks like it I think every time there is an effort to I think Ido was receiving a call and somehow it cuts out every time that happens. I think he's on a portable unit here. So we're going to see if we can get him back in a second. And hopefully he can come back. He'll probably reconnect. There we go. All right. There we go. Hey, Ido. Sorry, I think you might be receiving calls, and every time that happens, it cuts out and we can't hear you anymore. But
Yeah.
you can hear us now. Yeah, I mean, just to recap, the question was, why is it? What is happening? What is or society, or what initiative has there been in Israel among the youth to using technology?
Yeah. So I said it's a combination of several things. Many years ago, about 50 years ago, the Israeli government created a fund to seed startups, especially in agriculture in the beginning, but then it moved on to other areas. But it has a lot to do with the culture. In Israeli culture, argument is a very common form of expression. Israelis are very argumentative. Also, Israelis tolerate failure. Failure is not encouraged. It's not that you're encouraged to fail, but people are not afraid to fail. And when they do fail, it doesn't break them. They move on. And then lastly, because Israel is a melting pot society, you have lots of ethnicities. There's a great deal of tension between the various groups in Israel. The groups are either they're divided along religious, ethnic, political lines. That very friction between the various groups is the engine that sparks the creativity. And you see that especially in the arts, in theater, in literature, even in dance. You see it wherever you go. Wherever you go, you see Israeli creativity, certainly in science. And so these are really the building blocks of Israeli creativity. It has a lot to do with the Jewish roots, with what we call Talmudic experience. The Talmud is perhaps the greatest body of work that emerged out of endless arguments between people, just people sitting together in one room and argue about everything and anything, and they produce texts based on those arguments. And I think that's a wonderful thing to understand Israeli creativity, is to go back to the roots of the Jewish tradition.
And that's also the case for this generation coming up right now. They're into that
Absolutely.
same culture, just like their parents were and their grandparents were. Because that's something that I think has been lost. I think there's a certain work ethic that has been lost. I mean, I'm speaking for here in France. I see it with some of my interns. It just gets worse every year, unfortunately. And it's very consumption oriented. And I've said to young people here, you're on TikTok every day, having a great time. Why don't you, and yet you're a dancer, or you play the flute, or you're a musician. Why don't you create something? But no, it's just easier to sit and scroll, right? So, yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, I think that something can be learned from what you're saying, and how all that kind of has occurred in the Israeli culture and in Israel. Ido, I know you're sitting in the lobby. You probably have to go to another class, I'm guessing, or is it over yet? No, it's a long
No,
day for you guys.
I have to drive back to my home, which is in the mountains. So I'm
Oh,
about
well,
an hour
okay.
drive away.
Well, I don't want to keep you until
But
it's pit blackout.
I would like to invite you and all your listeners and viewers to come and visit this amazing museum. Let me just show you the
Please
lobby.
do. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Is it
It's
new?
called it's renovated. It's called Anu, which means in Hebrew we. And it's the Museum of the Jewish People. It's a phenomenal museum, really, and you can have see a show about Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan and all the great Jewish musicians here as well. So
That's
thank you so
that's
much for having
amazing.
me. It was a true
Thank you.
delight, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Absolutely. It's been a while given the COVID pandemic. Ido Aharoni,
Yes,
thank you. Career diplomat,
thank you.
thank you so much. It's been a
All
pleasure.
right, bye bye.
Bye. All right. So that was Ido Aharoni, career diplomat and former consul general to New York, Israeli consul general to New York, and technological expert. So it's really interesting to get a kind of this big picture view of the world and how technology currently interacts with it and what the future might look like. And also a little bit of a discussion there on how it plays when it comes to conflicts and news and information and that kind of thing. So fascinating discussion. Now, as promised, some of you have been waiting since the beginning of the show. I want to get back into Justin Trudeau's wonderful experience at the European Union. He the trucker convoy, basically saying, hey, 90% of the truckers are vaccinated, so these are just fringers. That's kind of been his narrative all along, totally ignoring the fact in front of EU parliamentarians, just as he did in front of a Canadian audience nationally, ignoring the fact that it wasn't about anti-vaxxers versus vaxxers. It was about being a pro-choice and against forced government mandates, against authoritarian approach to the sanitary crisis. So I already played for you guys at the beginning of the show what he said about the fact that that in Canada, the Freedom Convoy was effective, quote unquote, effective at turning citizens with real anxieties that, of course, had nothing to do with the government provoking them in the context of the pandemic, against the system best suited to allay those concerns. Right. So just trust us, right? What could go wrong? Now, Trudeau invoked emergency powers to quash those protests and block the accounts of people who donated to the cause, Canadians who donated to the cause. Now, this is what, this is what Justin has to say about his lofty democratic ideals. This was Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, in front of the EU Parliament yesterday.
Putin thought democracy was weak. He saw our disagreements and debates as weakness. But what he has never understood is that the rigors of debate, that forceful civic engagement, is what makes us strong. And that democracy, at its best, will always be stronger than authoritarianism. But if we're going to be honest, and we need to be honest in this place, we haven't always been at our best these past years.
I guess he speaks for himself. Guy, after invoking martial law, he comes and lectures Europeans about Vladimir Putin's freedom or lack thereof in Russia. I don't know. I mean, maybe you should sweep in front of your door first, Justin, instead of lecturing the world. But let's hear what the EU Parliament MPs had to say to Justin Trudeau's face. This is one of the MPs who I believe is a German far-right populist MP. I say that because if I don't qualify who they are, there are going to be people in comments at the bottom of this show on YouTube and other platforms saying, oh, well, she didn't say who that guy was who said those bad things about Justin Trudeau. She didn't point out that he's like a far right-wing populist. Well, why do we never point out that when Justin Trudeau is praised, it's some loony left-winger? Why do we have to qualify who these people are, and only in one way? Only when they're criticizing him. But if they're praising him, we don't have to point out that some loony lefty. So here is the right-wing guy, one of them from Germany's far-right party, lambasting Justin Trudeau yesterday in Parliament.
Honourable members, we keep discussing here our European democratic values that underpin.
Just so you know, this is a translator. Bernhard Zimnock is the name of the German European deputy. And this is a translator translating from his speech in German.
All of our actions. I worked in Syria and Pakistan for many years as a diplomat and therefore value democracy very highly. Now, the invitation to Canadian PM Justin Trudeau is an invitation to someone who's been trampling on democratic rights, who's been cracking down on people who protested against disproportionate corona measures, people's who were supporting a non-sanctioned movement coming under criticism. So clearly the values of democracy are being despised by this individual. Let us not give someone like this any speaking time in this house of democracy. Honourable members,
I don't know how much the EU is a house of democracy. but they're still conscious enough of what's right and wrong to, some of them are still lucid enough to realize that what Justin Trudeau has been doing in Canada to the trucker convoy, the Freedom Convoy protesters, is not democratic. And imposing martial law is not democratic, despite what Trudeau says. So, yeah, that's Bernhard Zinyak. And there is another member of parliament. It seems like Germany's far-right party is really ganging up on Justin Trudeau. Keep in mind, he was present there. They said this to his face. So this is Christine Anderson, another German European parliamentarian. I believe she speaks in English in this one. This is what she has to say about Justin Trudeau in Brussels today.
Based on Article 195, out that it would have been more appropriate for Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to address this House according to Article 144, an article which was specifically designed to debate violations of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is clearly the case with Mr. Trudeau. Then again, a prime minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this house at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
Yeah, they're really pulling punches. All right, so it's not just the Germans on the far right in the EU Parliament who are criticizing Trudeau. There is also Romanian European parliamentarian Christian Terhes, Terhes, and he spoke in English as well, so I'll let you hear it.
And with the Prime Minister of Canada, the way he's behaving right now, he's exactly like a tyrant, like a dictator. He's like Ceausescu in Romania. If even you doubt, if you raise doubts about the vaccines, you're outcasted. What's the difference between what he does and what happened under the Inquisition? See, on one side they say, well, we should not believe in God, but on the other side they say, believe in science. We don't have to. Science is not about belief. Science is about measurements, conclusions, hypotheses, and arguments. We got to a point right now where even if you say something, if you raise any doubts, you're already considered, as whatever, they label you in very different ways. This is not okay. And I have to tell you, that when I saw the protests in Canada, the way the truckers over there reacted, I got in touch with some of them, others contacted me. I congratulated them, and I want to use this opportunity to thank them. And I hope this movement for freedom and for rights is spreading all around the world. Because at the end of the day, we have to make sure that all these elected officials, they understand that they were elected in those offices to work for the people, not to behave like masters of slaves. Thank you.
Eddie,
All right, so these are all populist parties in the European Parliament. Is it any wonder that the ideological dichotomy in the world is now no longer communism versus capitalism, but instead populism versus globalism? Because Justin Trudeau is right in line with the whole World Economic Forum Great Reset agenda and I've written about that. You can go to my website at rachelmarsden.com if you want to see the details of that. I won't get into it here because it's just a whole other show, and I'm sure we're going to get into it on another show. So I'll save it for that. But Justin Trudeau represents an ideology of globalism. And these parliamentarians criticizing him in the EU represent the opposition to that. And that is the dichotomy today. One can even argue that the Western sphere of influence, aka the people criticizing Russia, Vladimir Putin, are also representative of that globalist mindset. And that although China exploits globalism for its own benefit, the Eastern sphere is more interested in internal economic development more than anything else, and just kind of using extra globalism, well, exploiting globalism. And the West has let them by outsourcing industry to them because it's cheaper, right? So I think we're heading for a increased fracture, despite what Ido said about there being more technological connection than ever before. I think he's absolutely right about that. But I think there is going to be an increased amount of protectionism between two spheres that have now almost officialized a rupture with this incident, a conflict in Ukraine. And this isn't even the end of the criticisms of Justin Trudeau. There is another one here in the European Parliament again, Mislav Kolakusic. He's a member of European Parliament from Croatia. And his speech is in Croatian. But what I'm going to do is turn it right down. And I don't speak Croatian. I speak fluent French, English, and Russian. And some of the words in Croatian are very similar. When I listened to it, I was like, wow, certain words are Russian almost. But there is a translation on the video. So as he's speaking, I'm going to read to you what he said. Okay. This is another criticism right to Justin Trudeau's face. Here we go. Dear colleagues, dear citizens, Prime Minister Trudeau. Freedom, the right to choose, the right to life, the right to health, the right to work, for many of us are fundamental human rights, for which millions of citizens of Europe and the world have laid down their lives. To defend our rights and the rights of our children, which we have acquired over the centuries. Many of us, including myself, are willing to risk our own freedom and our own lives. Unfortunately, today there are those among us who trample on those fundamental values. Canada, once a symbol of the modern world, has become a symbol of civil rights violations under your quasi-liberal boot in recent months. We watched how you trample women with horses, how you block the bank accounts of single parents so that they can't even pay their children's education and medicine, that they can't pay utilities, mortgages for their homes. To you, these may be liberal methods. For many citizens of the world, it is a dictatorship of the worst kind. Rest assured that the citizens of the world united can stop any regime that wants to destroy the freedom of citizens, either by bombs or harmful pharmaceutical products. Thank you. Okay, so fact check, because I feel obligated to do that as a professional journalist, even though I'm on YouTube. Women being trampled by horses. There was an incident in Ottawa that he's referring to where one of the protesters was there, and there was a whole mass of protesters, and the police just came through on these giant horses. And there's a video floating around on social media showing the incident, and it's not entirely clear whose fault it was, whether this woman got in the way of the horse, whether it was a deliberate incident, whether it was just an unfortunate accident. I can't tell. I don't know who can, frankly, because they all, I mean, you can reach whatever conclusions you want with that video. I'm not able to ascertain whether there was a deliberate trampling of this protester by the horse. I'm sure the horse didn't mean it. the officer on the horse. The second thing he brings up there are blocking bank accounts of single mothers who can't pay their rent. It is a fact, and it was written into the Emergency Act, Trudeau's Emergency Act, martial law, that financial institutions, lending entities had to block bank accounts of those who it considered involved in some way or another with these freedom convoy protests. And it was not very well defined as to what that meant. So I do know that there are reports of people who simply donated through online platforms to the Freedom Convoy, and they ended up having their bank accounts frozen. It had a chilling effect. It's kind of like when you know that you can be sued for defamation. It has a chilling effect on free speech because you start to self-censor. That's kind of the effect, I think, on a larger scale that we had with respect to the Emergency Act containing provisions of financial repercussions of blocking accounts of people who donated to the cause. I think people were then afraid to support the cause, not knowing exactly where that line was, what they might do that would trigger their own banking institution to either respond to a demand by authorities to block their accounts or to cancel their loans or mortgages or whatever it was. I think that was the bigger problem. So there you go. Justin Trudeau's having a great week here in Europe. Don't know where he's going next, but his tour is off to a bang. I guess he was probably happy to find Joe Biden and his fellow G7 and European Union globalist comrades here in the EU-SSR after that lambasting by the populist MPs in the European Parliament. It reminds me kind of when Emmanuel Macron, the French president, when there was the populist Gilets jaunes, yellow vest protests here in France, every single Saturday went on for a couple of years against an increase in gas tax, but then it just became about globalist unilateral decision making that are completely divorced from the realities on the ground of the average person. And then Macron, it's like he was just being besieged by this constant protesting, and it was just everywhere in the news and global attention to it. And then he gets on a plane, goes somewhere for some summit or some foreign visit, and the cameras show him coming down the steps of the French presidential plane, and the first thing he sees on the ground is some dude working there in a yellow vest. First thing Trudeau sees when he arrives in Europe is a bunch of populist MPs. So that is the show for today, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate some of your comments. We didn't have a lot of questions today, so I hope you guys were able to sit and enjoy and listen and enjoy a cold beverage while you did so. Just to give you a bit of a heads up as to what's happening next week, we will have shows again on Monday and Tuesday at least. Thursday, probably. Monday, we're going to have Dr. Sam Dubé, who is a Canadian professor and medical expert, to talk about everything COVID, because that seems to have dropped off the radar ever since the Ukraine issue. Tuesday, we are going to have Scott Ritter. Some of you might recognize that name. He is the former United Nations weapons inspector who contradicted the United States government on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And he's still very active in writing books and articles. He's also a former Marine Corps intelligence officer in the United States. And he's going to talk about Ukraine as well and his observations on everything that's going on in the world these days. So in the meantime, I have some new articles coming up myself. You can check out rachelmarsden.com online if you're interested in reading more. some of the issues I've touched on in this show, I also address in those columns. So that is it for today and this week. Thank you again so much for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be. And we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.